BRICS summit with Egypt and Ethiopia joining the BRICS bloc in 2024. It'll mean that 3 African countries have been represented. How can the continent benefit from the expansion? Let's unpack this now with Victor Kgomoeswana, who is the Marketing Communication Executive Director at the University of Limpopo. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. It's an important question as we try and sort of get over the excitement and ask what is in it for Africa.
Good day, Mpo. It's good to talk to you again. What is in it for Africa is I've always felt that BRICS with only South Africa in the mix will never mean much for the continent, except that Africa could be the target of Chinese corporations, of Brazilian corporations, of Russian companies. But now that you have a much more wider, broader representation, bear in mind, South Africa is just, 60 million people, but Egypt is over 100 million people, so is Ethiopia. Already, when you go with a market size of more than 200 million people, whoever you are talking to, you have the bargaining power of the numbers behind you. But more than that, Paul, the intriguing inclusion of Ethiopia and Egypt is that not so long ago, we thought these countries were going to be going to war with each other over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. So having Egypt and its neighbor being able to be part of the same bloc means that South Africa has used its membership of BRICS to have more African representation. And as you saw how President Ramaphosa managed to invite a lot more African leaders, it's a matter of time before more and more African countries are members of this bloc, or if they are not, the representation, the African representation becomes a lot more Pan-African and takes into account the interests of more than just the 3 countries that are members at the moment. This is the beginning of multilateralism, but I think it happens at the right time because Africa is trying to drive intra-Africa trade and investment, and to have one united approach, one unified approach to international relations can only benefit that intra-Africa trade and investment.
As you speak about investment, Africa, of course, a stronger voice on the world stage and makes, but in terms of the addition being a game changer for the world economic order, that has been spoken to quite a bit. How does it then make a difference to the global financial architecture?
You know, I grew up in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and when we were either pro-Russia and communism or you were pro-America, NATO and capitalism. And now the new world order is multilateralism. There are many interests in the world, and there's no way of just having a bipolar configuration of the universe. So the importance of this is that Africa will have an option of doing business with whoever. Don't forget that before this BRICS summit, Africa was being told, South Africa was being told, do not do this with Russia, do not do this with that country, do not do this with China. So the fact that BRICS is now a lot more inclusive assemblage of countries tells you that the world is accepting more and more that it's not just West versus East, it's a matter of what's good for humanity. And although it's early days yet, and I'm sure it will take a long time before the benefits of this BRICS bloc with 11 members are felt by the ordinary people, but at least the world has learned that it's no longer just you are either with NATO or you are against NATO, or you are with the West or with the East. It's a show that you can have Middle Eastern countries like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, you can have Iran, you can have Russia, you can have South American countries in Brazil and Argentina, and African countries in the form of that. So world trade is becoming a lot more, what shall I say, mixed and a lot more eclectic, if you like, rather than just being divisive. Because when you have to choose sides between 2 powers, you are always going to find yourself compromised.
You talk about world acceptance being very significant here. We have listened to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was speaking for change in the global framework and really putting to the forefront equal treatment for the continent. I mean, with these new additional members, 2 being African, how does that now place the continent a bit further in terms of saying, recognize me, here I am, and I'm here to stay and have my say?
Remember the fight between Russia and China, U.S. and China and U.S. and Russia is not the fight for politics, it's fight for economics or over economics. These superpowers are fighting to control the resources that Africa has, but also to sell its wares, products and services and even culture to the African continent, which is over 1 billion people. So by having a lot more substantial representation or substantive representation in forums like BRICS will mean that whoever wants to deal with the superpower that is China, the new superpower effectively, that is China, and India, remember those two countries combined are nearly 3 billion people out of the 7 billion people on earth. So when you have to be in the same league, in the same company as that, you stand to now be seen in that same light that you are part of a bloc. Because remember what BRICS is trying to do is trying to influence multilateralism to make sure that there's more justice at the multilateral organizations like the United Nations. But if you look at the declaration, they are also talking about the reform of the agencies like the World Bank, agencies like WTO. They are trying to create a more just dispensation. Now, when BRICS was just 5 countries, it didn't have as much bargaining power as now when it commands over 35% of the world's GDP nominal. So it means that you have more bargaining power and you're likely to influence the world order better by influencing the multilateral agencies like the United Nations. You can expect to see the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations. You can expect to see WTO, the World Trade Organization, being a lot more responsive to the needs of the emerging economies or emerging markets and developing countries, as mentioned in the BRICS declaration. And you're also likely to see more options. So Africa no longer has to subject itself only to the IMF or the whims of the so-called Bretton Woods institutions. It will have the option of borrowing from everywhere else and negotiating even that de-dollarization that everybody is talking about. Yeah. You have already seen Argentina paying some of its debt to the IMF in the Chinese currency. So that day is coming where there will not just be $1 that dominates the universe, but there will be many currencies. And that's, I think, what should be a fair dispensation for everybody.
Absolutely. You may have touched on this part very briefly. Perhaps your view on how one should interpret what some critics may say, dismissing the importance of the expansion of membership in itself, arguing that the BRICS do little and always will, and that what perhaps may matter is the expansion of the membership of the new development bank.
You know what? When international diplomacy matters, let's not undermine. You remember when President Ramaphosa went to Russia and people were saying, what is he doing there anyway? What could he possibly do? Well, there you have it. Diplomacy counts. The world is not going to World War III. Things are going to be solved by talking to one another, by respecting one another. So I would say, yes, it's true. I admit that BRICS will not deliver bread and butter issues to people who are underprivileged, but it is that creation of a new world order that will ensure that developing countries have a collective bargaining voice. And I'm not delusional about this. Africa is going to have to also protect its interests against the interest of China, because China is looking to feed itself, is looking to get the resources from the African continent. So is Russia. So when Africa does not collectively consider its own interests, it might not end up benefiting this. But long and short of it, international relations, international diplomacy matter, and we can't build a better world without it. So BRICS is part of that.
Thank you very much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Some thorough analysis there. Victor Kgomoeswana, who is the Marketing and Communication Executive Director at the University of Limpopo.